Sometimes, the greatest kindness we show a stranger becomes the moment that changes everything. For Elsbeth, a widowed healer living alone in her stone cottage, that moment came on a storm-filled night when compassion led her to open her door to a bleeding man. She had always been a healer, it was simply who she was. During the border wars, she had tended wounded soldiers. Now, at 58, she lived quietly at the edge of Thornwick Forest, keeping her herb garden and finding peace in solitude. But this stranger was different. His wounds healed too fast. His skin stayed cold as winter stone. When his eyes opened, they held the weight of centuries. She had saved something far more dangerous than a man. What happens when a woman discovers the stranger she rescued is an ancient vampire who now claims her as his own? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra, special for you. The stone cottage at the edge of Thornwick Forest had weathered 43 winters before Elsbeth came to call it home, and in the 7 years since Thomas's passing, it had become more than shelter. It had become her sanctuary. Built from the grey granite quarried from the nearby hills, its thick walls held the warmth of her hearth fire and the lingering scent of dried herbs that hung in bundles from the low-beamed ceiling. The cottage sat like a thoughtful meditation in the landscape, neither imposing upon the forest nor shrinking from it, but existing in quiet harmony with the ancient oaks and silver birches that surrounded it on 3 sides. Elsbeth rose each morning before dawn, not from necessity, but from habit, cultivated over decades of tending to those who needed healing. Her hands, lined now with the map of 58 years, moved with practiced grace as she lit the oil lamp beside her narrow bed and pulled on the wool dress she had mended so many times. It felt more like an extension of herself than mere clothing. The floorboards creaked, their familiar greeting beneath her bare feet as she padded to the kitchen, where embers still glowed in the hearth from the previous evening's fire. Her morning ritual began with the tea, chamomile and mint from her own garden, sweetened with honey she bartered for with old Henrik, whose bees thrived in the meadow beyond the village proper. As the kettle heated, she would stand at the small window that faced east and watch the sun paint the forest in shades of gold and amber. These moments of solitude had become precious to her when the world belonged only to her thoughts and the gentle sounds of awakening nature. Thomas's wedding ring still circled her finger, the simple gold band worn smooth by years of wear and countless washings of healing hands. She had thought, in those first raw months after his death, that she might remove it, that continuing to wear it somehow dishonored his memory by pretending he might still walk through the door with his easy smile and arms full of firewood. But as the seasons turned and grief softened into a tender ache, she understood that the ring was not about pretending, it was about remembering love and how it shaped a person even in its absence. The cottage bore traces of their life together in every corner. The rocking chair by the fireplace, where Thomas would sit in the evenings, reading aloud from books of poetry while she prepared her medicinal tinctures. The wooden shelves he had built along the kitchen walls, perfectly sized for her collection of ceramic jars filled with powdered willow bark, dried nettle, and dozens of other remedies she had learned to prepare during her years tending soldiers in the border wars. The small table where they had shared countless meals, its surface scarred by decades of use, but still solid and faithful. Her herb garden stretched along the south side of the cottage, where morning sun would warm the soil and afternoon shade would protect the more delicate plants. Rows of lavender, rosemary and thyme grew alongside the medicinal herbs that were her specialty: echinacea for fighting infection, valerian root for calming anxious minds, and comfrey for mending broken bones. She had learned the healing arts from her mother, who had learned from her mother before her, in a chain of women's wisdom that stretched back generations. During the border wars that had raged for 3 brutal years, this knowledge had saved more lives than she could count. The wars had ended a decade ago, but Elsbeth still remembered the endless stream of wounded men brought to her door. Young soldiers with sword cuts that needed stitching, older warriors with infected wounds that required careful cleaning and daily attention, men whose minds had been as damaged by what they had witnessed as their bodies had been by enemy blades. She had turned no one away, working by candlelight when necessary, giving her own food to those who needed strength for healing, and holding the hands of those who would not see another sunrise. It was this same instinct that had led her to the door 3 nights ago, when the storm had raged with unusual fury against the cottage walls. Thunder had shaken the very foundations, and lightning had turned the forest into a stark landscape of dancing shadows. She had been preparing for bed, braiding her silver-streaked hair and banking the fire for the night, when she heard what sounded like a body falling against her door. The wind had been howling so fiercely that she almost convinced herself she had imagined the sound, but then it came again, a desperate, weak knocking that spoke of someone in dire need. Without hesitation, she had pulled her shawl around her shoulders and lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured the door. When she swung it open, rain had driven into her face with stinging force, and there on her threshold lay a man unlike any she had ever encountered. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that clung to his skull like wet silk. His clothes, though finely made, were torn and stained with what appeared to be blood. But it was his face that had stopped her breath, pale as winter moonlight, with features that seemed carved from marble, beautiful in a way that suggested nobility, or perhaps something else entirely. He appeared to be unconscious, his breathing so shallow that she had to place her ear near his mouth to confirm he still lived. Without thought for her own safety, a tendency Thomas had often gently scolded her, for she had grasped the stranger under his arms and dragged him into the cottage. He was heavier than his lean frame suggested, his body possessing a solid density that made moving him a considerable effort. She had managed to get him to the small bedroom she used for tending patients, a simple space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and shelves lined with her healing supplies. By lamplight, she had begun to examine his injuries. What she found troubled her in ways she could not yet articulate. The wounds that had appeared so severe in the darkness seemed to be healing before her eyes. Cuts that should have required stitching were already closing, and bruises that should have taken weeks to fade were lightening by the hour. His skin, when she touched it to check for fever, was cold as river stone, even though he showed no signs of the shivering that usually accompanied such a condition. Most unsettling of all was the way he affected the very air around him. The cottage, which had always felt warm and welcoming, seemed to hold its breath in his presence. Shadows gathered in corners where they had never lingered before, and the flames in her oil lamps flickered as though touched by unseen breezes. Her healing herbs, usually so fragrant, seemed muted in their scents, as though his presence somehow dampened their natural properties. Yet, despite these strange signs, Elsbeth had tended him with the same care she would show any person in need. She had cleaned his wounds with warm water and calendula tincture, covered him with her softest blankets, and maintained a vigil beside his bed through the remainder of that storm-tossed night. She told herself that the oddities she noticed could be explained by exhaustion, by the dramatic circumstances of his arrival, by her own mind playing tricks in the dancing lamplight. The village of Thornwick lay a 20-minute walk through the forest, close enough that Elsbeth could easily reach the market or attend church services, but far enough that she enjoyed genuine solitude when she chose it. The villagers knew her as the healer woman who had served so faithfully during the wars, and they respected both her skills and her need for privacy. They brought their sick children to her door and paid her with vegetables from their gardens, wool from their sheep, and the countless small kindnesses that bound a community together. Father Marcus, the village priest, visited her cottage monthly to check on her welfare and to discuss the spiritual questions that sometimes arose in her healing work. A man of middle years, with gentle eyes and hands that had never known violence, He understood that Elsbeth's relationship with Faith had been complicated by the things she had witnessed during the wars. Their conversations were always thoughtful, never pressing, and she valued his friendship even when his presence reminded her of all the prayers that had gone unanswered during those dark years. But none of her village relationships had prepared her for the presence that now lay unconscious in her spare room. As she sat beside his bed on that first night, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest, she found herself studying his face with an intensity that surprised her. There was something ancient in his features, a quality that suggested he had witnessed far more of the world than his apparent age would indicate. His hands, when she checked his pulse, were unmarked by the calluses that came from honest labor, yet they possessed a strength that spoke of capabilities she could not identify. Sleep had come fitfully to her that night, filled with dreams that felt more like memories of places she had never been. She saw herself walking through midnight forests, where the moon cast silver light on paths that led to destinations beyond imagining. In these dreams, she was not alone. A figure walked beside her, tall and graceful, with eyes that held the depth of centuries and a voice that spoke her name like a prayer. She had awakened before dawn with her heart racing and the taste of rain on her lips, though the storm had passed hours earlier. The stranger still slept deeply, his breathing now so quiet that she had to lean close to assure herself he lived. In the pale morning light, his skin seemed to possess an almost luminous quality, as though lit from within by some source she could not comprehend. As she prepared her morning tea and tended to her daily tasks, Elsbeth found herself returning again and again to check on him. Each time, she noticed new details that deepened her puzzlement. His fingernails were perfectly shaped and clean, despite his rough journey through the storm. His hair, now dry, held a luster that seemed to reflect light in unusual ways. Most strange of all, he cast no reflection in the small mirror that hung beside the washstand, a detail that made her question her own eyesight and wonder if the stress of recent days had affected her more than she realized. By the second day, when he still had not awakened, she began to worry that his injuries were more serious than they appeared. She prepared stronger broths to tempt him back to consciousness and gathered her most potent healing herbs. Yet every time she checked his vital signs, they remained steady and strong. His pulse beat with the rhythm of perfect health, his breathing came deep and even, and his skin maintained that peculiar coolness that defied all her experience with treating the injured. It was on the morning of the third day that everything changed. She had just finished hanging fresh herbs to dry in the kitchen when she heard movement from the spare room, not the restless shifting of someone in deep sleep, but the deliberate sounds of someone awakening to full consciousness. Her heart began to beat more rapidly as she realized that she was about to meet the mysterious stranger who had appeared at her door like a gift from the storm itself. She smoothed her hair, straightened her dress, and walked slowly toward the room where he lay. At the threshold, she paused to steady herself, knowing that whatever happened next would somehow alter the quiet pattern of her days. Then, drawing upon the same courage that had carried her through the darkest nights of the border wars, she stepped forward to greet the man whose arrival had already begun to change everything about her carefully ordered world. The stranger's eyes opened like dark pools reflecting starlight, and Elsbeth felt her breath catch in her throat. They were not the confused, unfocused eyes of someone emerging from unconsciousness, but alert and aware, as though he had been listening to her approach long before she entered the room. When his gaze met hers, she experienced the peculiar sensation of being seen, truly seen, in a way that felt both intimate and unsettling. "You saved my life," he said, his voice carrying a rich timbre that seemed to resonate in her chest. There was an accent there, something old-world and refined, that spoke of distant places and forgotten times. "I am in your debt, gentle healer." Elsbeth moved closer to the bed, her healer's instincts overriding her nervousness. "How do you feel? You've been unconscious for 3 days." I was beginning to worry that your injuries were more serious than they appeared." He sat up with fluid grace, the blankets falling away to reveal that his wounds had indeed healed completely. Where deep cuts had marred his chest and arms, only faint silver lines remained, like old scars that had faded with time. His skin, pale as winter frost, seemed to gleam in the lamplight, and she noticed again that peculiar coolness when her fingers accidentally brushed his wrist while checking his pulse. "My name is Darian," he said, watching her face carefully as though gauging her reaction. "And you are Elsbeth. I heard you speaking to yourself as you worked. It is a beautiful name, worthy of a woman with such a generous heart." Something in the way he spoke her name made it sound like music, and she felt an unexpected flush of warmth rise to her cheeks. "You must be hungry," she said, stepping back to maintain a proper distance. "I'll prepare some broth. You'll need to regain your strength slowly." But when she turned toward the door, his voice stopped her. "Elsbeth." The sound of her name on his lips seemed to hang in the air between them. "I must tell you something important. You have shown me kindness beyond measure, but there are things about me that you should know before you offer more aid." She turned back to face him, noting how the shadows in the room seemed to gather around him like living things. On his right hand, she glimpsed a silver ring, bearing symbols she did not recognize, ancient markings that seemed to shift and change when she looked at them directly. The ring appeared old beyond measure, its surface worn smooth by countless years of wear. "What things?" she asked, though part of her sensed that she might not want to hear the answer. Darian rose from the bed with movements that seemed too graceful for someone who had been near death just days before. He was taller than she had realized, and there was something about the way he moved that reminded her of a predator, controlled, purposeful, and utterly silent. When he walked to the small window, his feet made no sound on the wooden floor. "I am not what you believe me to be," he said, gazing out at the forest where afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen. "I am something that most people would fear, and rightfully so. Something that should not exist in a world where good people like you tend gardens and heal the wounded." Elsbeth felt a chill run down her spine, but she forced herself to remain calm. During the border wars, she had learned to face danger with steady nerves, and whatever this man might be, he had made no move to harm her. "Tell me plainly what you mean." He turned from the window, and in the fading light, his pale skin seemed almost luminous. "I am what your people call vampire, Elsbeth. The first of my kind, what others call an alpha. I have walked this earth for more than 8 centuries, and I have done things that would horrify you if you knew their full measure." The words hung in the air between them like a challenge. Elsbeth felt her logical mind reject what he was saying, even as some deeper instinct recognized the truth in his confession. It would explain the impossible healing, the cold skin, the way shadows seemed drawn to him, and that strange absence of reflection she had noticed in the mirror. "That's impossible," she said, but her voice carried less conviction than she intended. Darian smiled, and she saw the subtle elongation of his canine teeth, not the dramatic fangs of village tales, but a slight sharpening that spoke of a nature designed for purposes she did not want to contemplate. "Is it? You are a healer, trained to observe details others might miss. Tell me what you noticed about my wounds, about the way I feel beneath your touch, about the things your instincts whispered when you looked upon me." She opened her mouth to deny what he was suggesting, but the words would not come. Every strange detail she had tried to rationalize over the past 3 days suddenly arranged itself into a pattern that made terrible sense. The rapid healing, the unnatural coolness, the way her herb seemed muted in his presence, and most of all, the dreams that had plagued her sleep, dreams of midnight forests and eternal walks with a companion whose face she could never quite see. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, sinking into the chair beside the bed. "If what you say is true, why reveal yourself to someone who has shown you only kindness?" "Because I cannot continue accepting your care under false pretenses," he replied, moving to kneel beside her chair so that their eyes were level. "And because there are others of my kind who will come seeking me. I fled here to escape a blood feud that has raged for decades, but they will find my trail eventually. When they do, anyone who has sheltered me will be in mortal danger." The gravity in his voice made her believe him, and she felt fear settle in her stomach like a cold stone. Yet beneath the fear lay something else, a strange attraction that seemed to grow stronger the longer she remained in his presence. When he spoke of blood feuds and eternal existence, part of her mind recoiled in horror, but another part leaned forward with fascination. "What kind of blood feud?" she asked, surprised by her own calm. "My kind are not numerous, but we are not united either. There are those who believe that vampires should rule openly over mortal humans, using our superior strength and immortality to create a new order. I have always opposed this view, believing that we should exist in the shadows, taking what we need to survive but leaving mortal lives largely undisturbed." He paused, his dark eyes searching her face for signs of revulsion or terror. "When he found neither," he continued, "the faction that opposes me is led by my own progeny vampires I created in centuries past, who now seek to destroy me for what they see as weakness. They have been hunting me across Europe for the better part of a century, and my presence here puts you and your village in terrible peril." Elsbeth found herself studying his hands as he spoke, long-fingered and elegant, with that silver ring catching the lamplight. She tried to imagine those hands taking human life, but found the image difficult to reconcile with the gentleness he had shown in his interactions with her. "When you say you take what you need to survive," she said carefully, "you mean human blood?" "Yes." His honesty was stark and uncompromising. "I do not kill indiscriminately, and I have not taken a human life for feeding in more than 2 centuries. But I am what I am, and denying my nature entirely would mean my destruction." That night, as Darian rested in the spare room and Elsbeth lay in her own bed staring at the ceiling, she found sleep elusive. Every rational part of her mind insisted that she should send him away at first light, that harboring such a creature violated every principle of safety and sanity. Yet, when she imagined the cottage empty, again, filled only with her own solitary presence, the prospect seemed unbearably lonely. Her dreams, when they finally came, were more vivid than ever. She walked through moonlit forests, hand in hand with a figure of shadow and starlight, and when she looked into his eyes, she saw not a monster, but a soul carrying the weight of endless years. She awoke before dawn with her heart racing and the taste of midnight on her lips. From the spare room came the sound of movement, not the restless shifting of ordinary sleep, but something more purposeful. Rising quietly, she padded barefoot to his door and peered through the crack. What she saw there stopped her heart entirely. Darian knelt beside the window, his head tilted back and his lips pressed against the wrist of a figure cloaked in shadow. In the moonlight streaming through the glass, she could see the pale column of his throat working as he fed, and the sight filled her with a complex mixture of horror and fascination that left her trembling against the doorframe. When he finished, and the shadowy figure melted away into the darkness outside, he turned toward the door, as though he had known she was watching all along. Their eyes met across the space between them, and in that moment, Elsbeth understood that her quiet life had ended forever. She had not merely rescued a wounded stranger, she had invited something ancient and dangerous into her world, and nothing would ever be the same. Morning brought no comfort to Elsbeth's troubled thoughts. She moved through her usual routines with mechanical precision, lighting the fire, preparing her tea, checking her herb garden, but her mind remained fixed on what she had witnessed in the darkness. When she finally gathered the courage to face Darian, she found him sitting calmly at her kitchen table, fully dressed and appearing no different than any other guest who might share her morning meal. "You saw me feed," he said without preamble, his dark eyes meeting hers with steady directness. There was no shame in his voice, no attempt at deception or excuse. "I wondered how long it would take before you witnessed that particular reality." Elsbeth poured herself tea with hands that trembled only slightly, proud of her composure under circumstances that would have sent most people fleeing into the forest. "Who was it? The person at the window?" "A deer," Darian replied simply. "I have learned to sustain myself on animal blood when necessary, though it provides less nourishment than human blood and requires feeding more frequently. I did not want to venture far from your cottage while my strength was still returning." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by confusion at her own reaction. Why should it matter to her whether he had fed on human or animal? The man was a vampire, a creature that should not exist, whose very presence in her cottage defied everything she understood about the natural world. "Show me," she said suddenly, the words emerging before she could reconsider them. Darian raised one eyebrow, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both surprise and amusement. "Show you what, exactly? Your true nature. If I am to harbor you in my home, if I am to face whatever danger your presence brings to this village, then I need to understand exactly what you are." For a long moment, he studied her face with those unnaturally alert eyes. Around his neck, she noticed for the first time a pendant of some kind, a small crystal vial filled with what appeared to be dark liquid. When he moved, the vial caught the morning light, revealing its contents to be the deep crimson of blood. "Very well," he said finally. "But understand that once you see me as I truly am, there will be no returning to ignorance. Are you certain this is what you want?" Elsbeth nodded. Though her heart hammered against her ribs with such force, she was certain he could hear it. Darian rose from his chair with that fluid grace she was beginning to recognize as distinctly inhuman. As she watched, his features began to shift in subtle ways, his pale skin growing even more luminous, his dark eyes deepening until they seemed to hold depths of midnight sky. His canine teeth elongated just enough to become unmistakably fangs, and when he moved around the kitchen, his feet made no sound whatsoever on the wooden floor. Most unsettling of all was the way the very air around him seemed to respond to his presence. Shadows gathered at his feet like faithful hounds, and the flames in her oil lamps flickered despite the absence of any breeze. He moved with predatory grace to where she stood beside the hearth, stopping just close enough that she could feel the coolness radiating from his skin. "This is what I am," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in her very bones. "A creature of shadow and hunger, sustained by blood and bound to darkness. I have lived through the rise and fall of kingdoms, watched empires crumble to dust, and outlived every mortal soul I have ever cared for." Elsbeth found herself leaning closer rather than pulling away, fascinated despite her fear by the otherworldly beauty of his transformed appearance. "How long have you been alone?" The question seemed to surprise him, and for a moment his inhuman features softened with something that might have been pain. "Longer than you can imagine. My kind do not form lasting bonds easily. Too often they end in betrayal or tragedy. The blood feud that drove me here began when one I trusted above all others decided that my philosophy of coexistence was weakness that needed to be purged." "Tell me about the feud," she said, settling into her chair with the deliberate calm she had learned during the border wars. "If my village is truly in danger, I need to understand what we face." Darian allowed his features to return to their more human appearance, though the shadows continued to cling to him like living things. 3 centuries ago, I created a vampire named Lucian from a dying nobleman whose intelligence and ambition impressed me. I taught him everything I knew about our nature, our history, our responsibilities to both vampire and mortal worlds. He moved to the window, gazing out at the forest, where morning mist still clung to the ancient trees. The blood vial at his throat caught the light again, and Elsbeth found herself wondering about its significance. Lucian gathered others around him, vampires who shared his belief that we should rule openly over mortals rather than exist in secrecy. They called themselves the Crimson Covenant, and their methods became increasingly brutal as they sought to expand their influence. Villages burned, innocents died, and our kind risked exposure to mortal authorities who would stop at nothing to destroy us all. Elsbeth felt a chill settle in her bones as she began to understand the scope of what he was describing. And they're hunting you, because you oppose them. Because I have spent the last century systematically destroying their operations and freeing the mortals they enslaved. Each time they establish a stronghold, I find a way to undermine it. Each time they recruit new vampires to their cause, I either turn those vampires against them or ensure their permanent destruction. The casual way he spoke of destruction and death should have horrified her, but Elsbeth found herself thinking instead of the wounded soldiers she had tended during the border wars. Those men had killed enemy combatants without becoming monsters themselves. They had simply been fighting for something they believed in. "The pendant you wear," she said, nodding toward the blood vial. "What is its significance?" Darian's hand moved unconsciously to touch the crystal container. "It contains the blood of my sire, the vampire who created me 8 centuries ago. She was destroyed by Lucian's forces 2 years past, but not before she managed to warn me of their final plan. They intend to create an army of vampires large enough to openly challenge mortal governments for control of entire regions. And you think they've tracked you here?" "I know they have. The question is not whether they will come, but when. I had hoped to rest here only long enough to regain my strength before moving on, but—" He paused, his dark eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "But what?" "But I find myself reluctant to leave you," he admitted, his voice dropping to little more than a whisper. "There is something about you, Elsbeth, something that calls to parts of my nature I thought long dead. In 8 centuries of existence, I have never encountered anyone who makes me question my solitary path." The words hung between them like a bridge. Neither was certain they should cross. Elsbeth felt her cheeks warm with a blush that had nothing to do with the heat from the fireplace. For 7 years, she had convinced herself that the capacity for such feelings had died with Thomas. Yet here was this impossible man, awakening desires she had thought buried forever. "That's dangerous thinking for both of us," she said finally, though her voice carried little conviction. Darian smiled, and even without his fangs visible, there was something predatory in the expression. "Yes," he agreed, "it is. The question now becomes whether you're brave enough to embrace that danger, or wise enough to send me away before it's too late." As if summoned by his words, the sound of church bells drifted through the morning air from the direction of the village, Father Marcus calling the faithful to morning prayer. Elsbeth realized with a start that it was Sunday, and her absence would be noticed if she did not make an appearance soon. But as she looked at Darian, this creature of shadow and hunger who spoke to her of danger and desire, she found herself wondering whether attending church held the same meaning it once had. Everything in her carefully ordered world was changing, and she was no longer certain whether that change terrified or thrilled her. The walk to Thornwick village had never felt so long. Each step through the forest path carried Elsbeth further from the cottage where Darian waited, and closer to a community that knew nothing of the supernatural creature she now harbored. The familiar sounds of village life, children's laughter, the blacksmith's hammer, merchants calling their wares, seemed to belong to a different world entirely, one where vampires existed only in whispered tales, meant to frighten children on dark nights. Father Marcus greeted her warmly at the church entrance, his kind eyes studying her face with the perceptiveness that had made him a beloved spiritual guide to the village. "You look troubled, Elsbeth. Has something disturbed your peace?" She managed a smile that felt brittle as winter ice. "Just the changing seasons, Father. You know how autumn affects my spirits." But as she took her usual place in the simple wooden pew, Elsbeth found herself unable to concentrate on the familiar words of the service. Her mind kept drifting to Darian's revelation, to the way shadows gathered around him like living things, to the blood vial that hung at his throat containing the essence of his destroyed sire. When Father Marcus spoke of good and evil, of light conquering darkness, she wondered which side of that eternal struggle she now found herself supporting. The moonstone amulet Thomas had given her during their courtship felt warm against her throat, warmer than it had in years. The small pendant, carved with protective symbols their ancestors had trusted, seemed to pulse with gentle heat whenever she thought of Darian. Thomas had told her it would always keep her safe from harm, but now she wondered if its growing warmth meant it was trying to warn her of danger, or if something else entirely was causing its unusual behavior. After the service, she lingered in the village longer than usual, partly to maintain appearances and partly to delay her return to the cottage. At the market, she purchased supplies she didn't truly need and engaged in conversations that felt increasingly hollow. Mrs. Henley complained about wolves howling closer to the village than usual. Young Willem mentioned that several of his sheep had been found dead with strange wounds on their necks. Old Henrik reported that his bees had abandoned their hives overnight, as though fleeing from some unseen threat. Each piece of information struck Elsbeth like a physical blow. The supernatural world that Darian represented was already affecting her community, and she was the only one who understood what these signs truly meant. The weight of that knowledge settled on her shoulders like a burden she had never asked to bear. "You seem distracted today," Father Marcus observed, when their paths crossed near the baker's stall. "Are you certain nothing troubles you? Sometimes sharing our burdens can lighten their weight." For a moment, Elsbeth was tempted to confess everything, to tell this good man about the vampire in her cottage, about the blood feud that threatened their peaceful village, about the impossible attraction she felt toward a creature that should terrify her, but the words stuck in her throat. How could she explain something so far beyond ordinary experience without sounding like a woman whose mind had finally cracked under the weight of too much solitude? "I appreciate your concern, Father, but some burdens must be carried alone." His weathered hand touched her shoulder gently. "Remember, my child, that even in our darkest moments, we are never truly alone. Whatever shadows may gather in your life, there is always light to be found if we have the courage to seek it." The irony of his words was not lost on her as she made her way home through the forest. Shadows were indeed gathering in her life, but they came in the form of a man whose very existence challenged everything she had been taught about the nature of good and evil. Yet when she thought of sending Darian away, of returning to her solitary existence among the herbs and memories, something in her heart rebelled against the prospect. The cottage felt different when she returned, charged with an energy that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential. Darian was in the kitchen, moving with that uncanny silence as he prepared what appeared to be an evening meal from the supplies in her larder. The sight of him performing such an ordinary domestic task while wearing clothes that had been torn and bloodied just days earlier struck her as surreal. "How was church?" he asked, without turning around, though she was certain he had made no sound that could have announced her arrival. "Troubling," she admitted, setting her market basket on the table. "The village is experiencing strange incidents, dead animals with unusual wounds, livestock behaving erratically, predators venturing closer to human habitation than they should. I think your presence here is already affecting things in ways the villagers don't understand." Darian paused in his preparations, his hands stilling on the wooden cutting board. "I feared as much. Our kind emit an aura that disturbs the natural order. Animals sense our predatory nature, and even plants respond to the supernatural energy we carry. The longer I remain here, the more pronounced these effects will become." "Then perhaps you should leave," Elsbeth said, though the words tasted like ash in her mouth. He turned to face her then, his dark eyes searching her expression with an intensity that made her feel transparent. "Is that what you want? For me to disappear into the night as suddenly as I appeared?" The question hung between them, heavy with implications neither seemed ready to fully acknowledge. Elsbeth found herself thinking of the years since Thomas's death, years of quiet routines, of tending her garden and healing minor ailments, of watching the seasons change from her kitchen window while feeling as though life itself was passing her by. "I don't know what I want," she admitted. "A week ago, my greatest concern was whether the late herbs would survive the first frost. Now I'm harboring a vampire who speaks of blood feuds and eternal existence, while watching my community suffer consequences they don't even understand." "I could leave tonight," Darian offered, though something in his voice suggested the prospect pained him. "Find another refuge far from here, draw my enemies away from your village before they arrive in force. And what then? You continue running for another century while they pursue you across the countryside, bringing death and terror to whatever innocents cross their path." The question seemed to surprise him, and Elsbeth realized she was voicing thoughts that had been forming in her mind throughout the day. "During the border wars, I learned that sometimes running from a fight only ensures that more people get hurt in the long term. Sometimes the only way to end a conflict is to make a stand, even when the odds seem impossible." "This is not your war to fight," Darian said softly. "You are a healer, not a warrior." "Am I?" Elsbeth touched the moonstone amulet at her throat, feeling its unusual warmth pulse against her skin. "I've been thinking about something you said about never encountering anyone who makes you question your solitary path. Well, I've lived alone for 7 years, and in all that time, no one has made me question whether there might be more to existence than the quiet life I've built here." She moved closer to him, noting how the shadows in the kitchen seemed to respond to his presence, gathering and dispersing like faithful servants awaiting commands. "Perhaps we're both running from something, you from your enemies, and me from the possibility of feeling alive again." Before Darian could respond, a sound from outside froze them both in place, the unmistakable howl of something that was definitely not a wolf. It was answered by another, then another, until the forest around the cottage echoed with voices that spoke of hunger and hunting. Through the kitchen window, Elsbeth caught a glimpse of yellow eyes reflecting the lamplight, and she knew with cold certainty that their time of relative peace was coming to an end. "They've found me," Darian said, his voice carrying a weight of resignation and grim determination. "The scouts always come first, supernatural creatures bound to the will of my enemies. The main force will follow within days." Elsbeth felt fear settle in her stomach like a cold stone, but alongside it came something unexpected, a fierce protectiveness for this man who had brought magic and danger into her quiet world. "Then we'd better prepare for war." The supernatural howling continued through the night, circling the cottage, like a pack, testing the boundaries of some invisible barrier. Elsbeth and Darian sat by the hearth, watching shadows dance on the walls, while he shared fragments of a history that spanned centuries. His voice carried the weight of accumulated years as he spoke of empires that had risen and fallen, of plagues that had swept across continents, of wars fought by mortals who never suspected that immortal beings moved among them like chess masters, playing an eternal game. "I was mortal once," he said, staring into the flames that seemed to bend toward him as though drawn by his presence. "Born in the year of our Lord 1247, the second son of a minor English lord whose lands bordered the Welsh territories. My name was Darian Blackthorn, then a name I have kept through all the centuries that followed." Elsbeth found herself leaning forward, captivated, despite her fear, by this glimpse into a past that predated her own family's history by generations. "What happened to make you what you are now?" "Love," he said simply, and the single word carried such weight of sorrow that she felt tears prick her eyes. "I fell in love with a woman whose beauty transcended mortal understanding, whose wisdom spoke of ages I could not fathom. Elena was her name, and she was already ancient when she chose to grant me immortality rather than watch me age and die." He rose from his chair and moved to the window where the strange howling seemed closest, his reflection notably absent from the glass that showed only Elsbeth's concerned face. She taught me what it meant to be vampire, the gifts and the curses, the hunger and the power, the terrible isolation that comes from watching every mortal you care for crumble to dust while you remain unchanged. "Where is she now?" Elsbeth asked, though something in his expression suggested she already knew the answer. "Dead, these 2 years past, destroyed by Lucien's forces when she tried to warn me of their final plan." His hand moved to touch, the blood vial at his throat, and Elsbeth understood now why he wore it not as decoration but as memorial. "She was my sire, my teacher, my beloved for more than 3 centuries. Her destruction is another debt I owe the Crimson Covenant." Through the window, one of the glowing eyes drew closer, and Elsbeth caught a glimpse of something that was definitely not a natural wolf. The creature appeared larger than any earthly predator, with fur that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, and teeth that gleamed like polished bone in the darkness. "What are they?" she whispered. "Shadow hounds, creatures bound by blood magic to track vampire scent across vast distances. They cannot enter a dwelling uninvited, but their presence means Lucien's forces are close. Perhaps a day's ride, no more." Elsbeth felt her heart race with fear, but alongside the terror came something unexpected, a fierce determination to protect this man who had shared such intimate details of his impossible life. "There must be something we can do, some way to fight them." Darian turned from the window, his dark eyes reflecting the firelight like depths of still water. "There is one possibility, though it involves risks I would not ask you to take." "Tell me." He moved closer to her chair, kneeling beside it so their faces were level. "In my travels, I have learned of certain bloodlines, mortal families that carry traces of supernatural heritage from ancient unions between humans and other beings. Such individuals can form bonds with vampires that grant both parties increased power and protection." "Bonds?" Elsbeth's voice caught on the word, though she suspected she understood what he was describing. Claiming a ritual that would link us permanently, allowing me to share my strength with you while drawing upon your life force to amplify my own abilities. Together, we would be far more formidable than either could be alone." The moonstone amulet at her throat pulsed with warmth, and suddenly Elsbeth understood why it had been reacting so strongly to Darian's presence. "My grandmother used to tell stories about our family's history," she said slowly. "Tales of women who could speak with forest spirits, who knew things they shouldn't know, who lived longer than ordinary mortals and aged more slowly than their neighbors." "Your amulet responds to supernatural energy," Darian observed, reaching out to touch the small pendant with one finger. The moment his skin made contact with the stone, it flared with brilliant light that illuminated the entire cottage. "That suggests your bloodline carries exactly the heritage I described." Before either could comment further on this revelation, a new sound reached them from outside, not the howling of shadow hounds, but the deliberate footsteps of someone approaching through the forest. Darian was on his feet instantly, every line of his body tense with predatory alertness. "Someone comes," he whispered, mortal but moving with purpose through darkness that should blind human eyes. Through the kitchen window, they saw a figure emerge from the tree line, Father Marcus, carrying a torch and walking with determined steps toward the cottage door. His weathered face bore an expression of grim resolve that Elsbeth had never seen before, and in his free hand he carried what appeared to be an ancient leather tome. "Father Marcus," Elsbeth breathed. "But why would he come here in the middle of the night?" The priest's knock, when it came, was firm and authoritative. "Elsbeth, child, I know you're awake. I've come to discuss the stranger you've taken in, and the danger his presence brings to our village." Elsbeth and Darian exchanged glances filled with a mixture of alarm and confusion. How could the village priest know about Darian's true nature? What did his arrival mean for their tenuous safety? "There are things about your priest you should understand," Darian said, quietly, his voice carrying notes of surprise and something that might have been respect. "The tome he carries, the way he moves through darkness inhabited by shadowhounds without fear, he is not merely a man of God." As if to confirm Darian's observation, Father Marcus spoke again from beyond the door. "I am Father Marcus Thorn, keeper of the old knowledge and guardian of the sacred mysteries that predate the Church's arrival in these lands. I know what walks among us, and I know the choice that lies before us all." The revelation that her trusted spiritual advisor possessed, knowledge of the supernatural world, sent Elsbeth's mind reeling. Everything she thought she knew about her quiet village, about the people she had served and trusted for years, was proving to be far more complex than she had ever imagined. But as she looked at Darian, this impossible man who had brought magic and danger and the possibility of love into her carefully ordered life, she realized that complexity was not necessarily something to fear. Sometimes it was simply life revealing its true nature, stripping away the comfortable illusions that had kept her safely distant from her own deepest desires. "Let him in," she said finally. "If we're going to face whatever's coming, we need to understand all the forces at play." As she moved toward the door, the crimson rose that had been growing wild in her garden began to bloom despite the lateness of the season, its petals unfurling in the darkness like a promise of bonds yet to be forged. Father Marcus entered the cottage with the quiet authority of a man who had faced supernatural threats before. The ancient tome in his hands bore symbols that seemed to shift and writhe in the lamplight, and Elsbeth noticed that the shadowhound's howling ceased the moment he crossed her threshold. The priest's weathered face showed no surprise at finding Darian present, nor did he display the fear that most mortals would feel in the presence of a vampire. "The Thornwick Chronicles," he said, placing the heavy book on Elsbeth's kitchen table. "Records kept by the guardians of this region for more than 6 centuries, documenting every supernatural incursion and the methods used to contain them. Your arrival, Master Blackthorn, was foretold in these pages decades ago." Darian studied the priest with eyes that had learned to read truth and deception across 8 centuries of existence. "You are not what you appear to be, Father. None of us are, it seems." Marcus smiled grimly as he opened the tome to a page marked with black ribbon. "I am indeed a priest, but I also serve a far older covenant, one established when the first supernatural beings began walking among mortals. My order has protected villages like Thornwick for generations, maintaining the balance between worlds that most humans never suspect exist." Elsbeth moved closer to examine the book, gasping when she saw her own family name inscribed in elegant script across one of the yellowed pages. The text spoke of women born with the sight beyond sight, and blood that calls to shadow. Beside her name was a date, tomorrow's date, and a single word that made her blood run cold: choosing. "I don't understand," she whispered. "How can this book contain information about events that haven't happened yet?" "Time moves differently for some supernatural beings," Father Marcus explained. "The oracles who contributed to these chronicles could perceive threads of probability stretching into the future. They saw that Darian Blackthorn would come to Thornwick, that he would find sanctuary with a woman of the old bloodlines, and that their union would either save this region or doom it entirely." Through the window, new shapes moved in the darkness, not the shadow hounds that had circled the cottage earlier, but human figures with the pale skin and predatory grace that marked them as vampires. Darian tensed instantly, his features shifting to their more inhuman aspect as ancient instincts prepared him for battle. "Lucian's advanced scouts," he said, his voice carrying deadly calm. "3 of them, moving to surround the cottage. They've found me at last." The leader of the vampires stepped into the circle of light cast by the cottage windows, and Elsbeth saw a face of terrible beauty, framed by silver hair that gleamed like moonlight. When he smiled, his fangs caught the lamplight like polished daggers, and his red eyes held the cruel intelligence of a predator that had never known defeat. "Darian," the vampire called, his voice carrying clearly through the glass. "Come out and face judgment for your centuries of interference. Your pet mortal and her village priest cannot protect you from the justice of the Crimson Covenant." But instead of responding to the challenge, Darian moved to Elsbeth's side and took her hand in his cold fingers. "The claiming ritual," he said urgently. "If we're going to survive what's coming, we must forge the bond now, while we still have time." Father Marcus nodded gravely. "The cottage sits on sacred ground, a convergence of ley lines that will amplify the ritual's power. But understand, child," he said to Elsbeth, "once this bond is forged, there can be no return to your mortal existence. You will be forever changed, forever bound to the supernatural world." Elsbeth looked out at the pale figures gathering in her garden, then at Darian, whose dark eyes held 8 centuries of loneliness and hope. The choice before her was stark: cling to the safety of her mortal existence and watch this man face his enemies alone, or step across the threshold into a world of magic and danger where love might be possible even in the face of immortal conflicts. "What must I do?" she asked. Darian lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her palm. "Trust me," he said simply. "Trust in what we could become together." The silver-haired vampire outside began to speak in a language that predated any tongue Elsbeth recognized, and she felt the very air around the cottage begin to vibrate with malevolent energy. Windows rattled in their frames, and the flames in her oil lamps flickered as though fighting against supernatural winds. "The Hunter's Blade," Father Marcus said, opening his tome to a page that showed detailed illustrations of an ornate silver dagger. "Lucian carries it, a weapon forged specifically to kill vampires, blessed with rituals that make it lethal even to one of Darian's age and power." As if summoned by the priest's words, the silver-haired vampire drew a gleaming blade from beneath his dark cloak. The weapon seemed to drink in the moonlight, its surface covered with inscriptions that hurt to look upon directly. When he held it aloft, the other vampires arranged themselves in a ritual formation that spoke of preparation for ceremonial execution. "They mean to make an example of me," Darian said, his voice steady, despite the mortal danger gathering outside. "To show other vampires what happens to those who oppose the Covenant's vision of supernatural supremacy." Elsbeth felt something shift within her as she watched the enemies preparing their attack. The moonstone amulet at her throat blazed with warmth that spread through her entire body, and suddenly she could sense things that had been invisible moments before, lines of power that ran beneath the cottage like underground rivers, the spiritual strength radiating from Father Marcus's protective presence, and most of all, the potential that lay dormant in her own bloodline, waiting to be awakened. "Then, let's show them," she said, surprising herself with the steel in her voice, "what happens when they threaten someone I love." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that transformed everything. Darian's eyes widened with hope and wonder, while Father Marcus began chanting in the same ancient language the enemies used, his voice rising to counter their malevolent magic with protective power drawn from older, cleaner sources. Outside, Lucian raised the Hunter's Blade and spoke a word that shattered every piece of glass in the cottage windows. But instead of retreating from the supernatural assault, Elsbeth stepped forward and placed her hand over Darian's heart, feeling the strange rhythm that marked him as something beyond mortal understanding. "I choose this," she said. "I choose you. I choose to fight." The crimson rose in her garden burst into full bloom, its petals spreading wide despite the violence surrounding it, and Elsbeth knew that whatever came next, she would face it not as a lonely healer hiding from life, but as a woman who had finally found something worth risking everything to protect. The moment Elsbeth declared her choice, the cottage filled with light that had nothing to do with flame or lamp oil. It poured from her skin like liquid moonlight, racing along the lines of power that Father Marcus had spoken of, transforming the simple stone dwelling into something that pulsed with ancient magic. The attacking vampires outside recoiled as though struck by physical force, and their leader's cruel smile faltered for the first time. Impossible, Lucian snarled, his red eyes fixed on the luminous figure Elsbeth was becoming. The old bloodlines were extinguished centuries ago. We made certain of that. But Father Marcus was already moving, pulling a heavy object from beneath his priestly robes, a stone carved with symbols that seemed to writhe and shift in the supernatural light. The chronicle stone, Elsbeth realized, somehow, as knowledge she had never possessed flooded her mind like water breaking through a dam. It was an artifact of such antiquity that its origins predated recorded history, capable of revealing the true nature of any supernatural bloodline. "Place your hand upon it, child," the priest commanded, his voice carrying authority that brooked no argument. "Let the stone speak the truth your ancestors kept hidden for your protection." Elsbeth approached the stone with hands that trembled not from fear but from the power building within her. The moment her palm touched its carved surface, images exploded through her consciousness, memories that belonged not to her but to the women who had come before her. She saw her grandmother as a young woman, her eyes glowing with the same light that now emanated from Elsbeth's skin. Before that, her great-grandmother standing in a moonlit circle with creatures that moved like living shadow. And further back still, to the very beginning of her line, where a mortal woman knelt before a vampire lord whose face bore features Elsbeth recognized as her own. "Your bloodline descends from Adriana Thornwick," Father Marcus said, his voice reverent as he read from the glowing stone. "First daughter of a union between the vampire Lord Aldrich and a mortal woman gifted with supernatural sight, you carry within you the dormant essence of vampire nature, passed down through 20 generations but never awakened until now." The revelation struck Elsbeth like a physical blow. Everything about her life suddenly made terrible sense, her unnaturally long lifespan for someone who had lived through the hardships of the border wars, her ability to heal others with unusual speed and effectiveness, the way wounded soldiers had seemed to recover faster under her care than anyone else's. She had attributed these things to skill and dedication, never suspecting that supernatural power flowed in her very blood. "That's why the moonstone amulet reacts to Darian's presence," she whispered, understanding dawning like sunrise in her mind. "Thomas's family must have known what I was, even if I didn't." "The Thornwick line has been protected for centuries," Father Marcus confirmed. "Each generation of guardians passed down the knowledge to the next, waiting for the day when the dormant power would awaken. Your husband's family were among those guardians, though Thomas himself chose not to burden you with knowledge that might never be needed." Outside the cottage, Lucian's fury was building to dangerous levels. The silver-haired vampire began chanting in the ancient tongue, and the very ground beneath the cottage shook as he called upon dark powers to break through whatever protections surrounded the dwelling. His two companions joined their voices to his, and the night air filled with malevolent energy that made the walls groan under supernatural pressure. But Darian was no longer focused on the external threat. His attention was fixed entirely on Elsbeth, his dark eyes wide with wonder and something that might have been fear. "If you truly carry vampire heritage," he said slowly, "then the claiming ritual will not simply bond us, it will complete your transformation. You will become fully vampire, with all the gifts and curses that entails." "You mean immortality," Elsbeth said, though the word carried implications that staggered her. "I would live forever like you." "Forever is a long time to spend with someone," Darian replied, his voice soft with emotions he struggled to contain. "Are you certain this is what you want? There will be no aging, no natural death, no reunion with Thomas in whatever paradise awaits faithful souls." Only eternal existence in a world that will change around you while you remain constant. The choice before her was more complex than she had realized. Accepting the transformation would mean abandoning not just her mortal existence, but any hope of joining Thomas in the afterlife her faith promised. Yet when she looked at Darian, this man who had brought wonder and danger and the possibility of love back into her life, she knew her decision had been made the moment she pulled him from the storm. "Thomas would want me to live," she said with quiet conviction. "He would want me to choose love over loneliness, even if that love leads to a path he cannot follow." The chronicle stone blazed brighter at her words, and suddenly the cottage filled with the presence of women who had died long before Elsbeth's birth. They stood like ghosts made of light and memory, her grandmother and great-grandmother, and all the others who had carried vampire blood in dormant form through the centuries. Their voices spoke in harmony, filling the air with words that resonated in her very bones. "The blood calls to blood," they said. "The shadow seeks its sister. The choice is made, the path is set, the transformation begins." Father Marcus opened his tome to a page that showed detailed instructions for the claiming ritual, but Elsbeth barely heard his voice as he began to read the ancient words. Her attention was fixed on the window where Lucian stood, with the hunter's blade raised high, his face twisted with rage at the realization that his quarry was about to become something far more dangerous than a lone vampire fleeing justice. "If she completes the transformation," the silver-haired vampire snarled to his companions, "she will possess power none of us can match. The union of vampire lord and awakened bloodline heir has not occurred for 500 years. We must stop this before it reaches completion." But even as he spoke, Darian took Elsbeth's hand and drew her close, his cold fingers intertwining with hers. The moment their skin touched, power flowed between them like electricity, and she felt something fundamental shift in her very essence. The dormant vampire nature her ancestors had carried awoke with sudden, overwhelming force. Her canine teeth elongated into delicate fangs, her skin took on the luminous pallor of immortal beauty, and her senses expanded to encompass details of the world she had never perceived before. She could hear the heartbeats of small creatures in the forest, smell the fear radiating from Lucian's companions, and see the complex patterns of magical energy that connected all supernatural beings to each other. Most amazing of all, she could feel Darian's emotions as clearly as her own, 8 centuries of loneliness, dissolving into wonder and hope as the bond between them grew stronger with each passing moment. Through their connection, she experienced fragments of his vast memories, saw glimpses of the world as it had existed in ages past, and understood for the first time the true scope of the supernatural realm that existed alongside mortal society. "It is done," Father Marcus said, his voice filled with awe as he watched the transformation complete itself. "You are no longer merely mortal, Elsbeth Thornwick. You are something new, something that bridges the gap between human and vampire in ways that have not been seen for centuries." Outside, Lucian's rage reached its breaking point. With a roar that shattered the remaining glass in the cottage, he raised the hunter's blade and spoke a word of power that tore through the protective barriers surrounding the dwelling. The silver-haired vampire and his companions rushed forward as one, intent on destroying the newly transformed couple before their combined power could be fully realized. But as they crossed the threshold into the cottage, they met not the frightened healer and isolated vampire they had expected to find. Instead, they faced 2 beings whose power flowed together like rivers joining to form an unstoppable torrent, ready to defend their love and their chosen home against any threat the supernatural world could offer. The final battle for Thornwick and for the future of the supernatural balance in the region was about to begin. The cottage exploded into chaos as Lucian and his companions crossed the threshold, their supernatural speed turning them into blurs of pale motion and deadly intent. But they met resistance they had not anticipated. Elsbeth's newly awakened power, combined with Darian's centuries of experience, created a defense that stopped their assault like a stone wall rising from the earth itself. Light poured from Elsbeth's transformed form, not the gentle glow of before, but brilliant radiance that forced the attacking vampires to shield their eyes. Through her bond with Darian, she felt his tactical mind, assessing their enemies' strengths and weaknesses, while her own intuitive understanding of the cottage's protective properties suggested strategies he could never have conceived alone. The Alpha's crown, Lucian snarled, producing a circlet of black metal from beneath his cloak. The moment he placed it on his silver hair, his form began to change, growing larger and more terrible as the artifact amplified his vampiric nature to its fullest expression. You may have awakened old blood, little healer, but I carry the authority of the first vampire lords. Your transformation means nothing against 5 centuries of accumulated power. The crown itself seemed alive, pulsing with dark energy that made the air around Lucian shimmer like heat waves rising from summer stone. Elsbeth could see now what Father Marcus had meant about weapons forged specifically for supernatural warfare. This was no mere ornament, but a tool that concentrated the essence of vampiric dominion into something that could command lesser beings and amplify the wearer's natural abilities beyond mortal comprehension. The crown enhances his power, Father Marcus warned, his own hands glowing with protective light as he maintained the rituals that kept the cottage from being torn apart by supernatural forces. But it also makes him vulnerable to certain specific countermeasures. The old chronicles speak of ways to turn such artifacts against their wielders. Through the shattered windows, more figures emerged from the forest, not vampires this time, but other supernatural creatures bound to the Crimson Covenant's service. Shadow hounds the size of horses padded through the moonlight, their eyes burning like coals and their fangs dripping with venom that would paralyze even immortal flesh. Behind them came beings. Elsbeth had no names for creatures of mist and malevolence that seemed to shift between solid form and incorporeal shadow as they moved. But what terrified her most was the realization that this was only the beginning. Through her enhanced senses, she could detect other presences approaching through the forest, dozens of them, perhaps more. The Crimson Covenant had not sent a simple assassination force, they had brought an army. How many? Darian asked, his voice grim as he too perceived the gathering threat. More than we can handle alone, Elsbeth replied, though she was surprised to find that fear was not her dominant emotion. Instead, a fierce protectiveness filled her for Darian, for Father Marcus, for the village that lay sleeping beyond the forest, unaware that their world teetered on the edge of supernatural war. Then we don't fight alone, Father Marcus said, opening his tome to a page covered with names written in different hands across many centuries. The Guardians of Thornwick have allies, other protectors, who have sworn to defend this region from supernatural threats. I can call them, but doing so will expose the existence of our hidden world to mortals who have never suspected such things exist. Elsbeth thought of the villagers she had known for years, Mrs. Henley with her gentle complaints about wolves, young Willem tending his sheep, old Henrik with his abandoned beehives. They deserved to know that danger threatened their peaceful lives, deserved the chance to choose whether to flee or stand and fight for their homes. Call them, she said, all of them. If we're going to make a stand here, let it be with the full truth revealed. The priest nodded gravely and began speaking in a voice that carried far beyond the cottage walls, not shouting, but using some supernatural amplification that sent his words echoing through the village and the surrounding countryside. He spoke of ancient compacts and sacred duties, of threats that had emerged from shadow to threaten the balance between worlds. As his words faded, lights began appearing in the village, not the warm glow of oil lamps, but the steady illumination of people deliberately revealing their presence. Through her enhanced vision, Elsbeth watched figures emerge from houses she had known for years, and she gasped to realize how many of her neighbors carried weapons that gleamed with supernatural properties. Mrs. Henley stepped into her garden, carrying a staff topped with crystals that pulsed with protective energy. Willem emerged from his cottage, bearing a sword whose blade seemed to be forged from captured moonlight. Even old Henrik appeared, his weathered hands holding a bow that thrummed with power despite having no visible string. "The Guardian families," Father Marcus explained, seeing her astonishment. "Mortal bloodlines that have served as protectors for generations, maintaining the ancient compact that keeps supernatural threats contained. They have been waiting for this night, preparing for the possibility that the old enemies might return in force." But Lucian was not content to wait for reinforcements to arrive. With a gesture that sent power crackling through the air like visible lightning, he commanded his forces forward in a coordinated assault designed to overwhelm the cottage's defenses before the Guardian families could join the battle. The first wave struck like a hurricane of supernatural fury. Shadow hounds leaped through the broken windows while the mist creatures flowed through gaps in the walls like water seeking the lowest ground. Lucian himself moved with speed that would have been impossible to track before Elsbeth's transformation, the hunter's blade weaving patterns of death as he sought to reach Darian's heart. But the newly bonded pair fought as one being, their movements synchronized in ways that transcended conscious thought. Where Darian's centuries of combat experience provided tactical knowledge, Elsbeth's intuitive understanding of the cottage's protective properties created opportunities he could exploit. Her light drove back creatures that thrived in darkness, while his strength provided the force needed to capitalize on the openings she created. Father Marcus chanted continuously, his voice weaving protective barriers that turned aside the most dangerous attacks while providing covering fire in the form of blessed light that seared supernatural flesh like acid. The Thornwick Chronicles lay open before him, its pages turning of their own accord to reveal countermeasures for each new threat that emerged from the attacking force. Through the chaos of battle, Elsbeth felt something unexpected joy. Not happiness at the violence, but pure exhilaration at finally understanding what she was meant to be. For years, she had lived as a healer, constrained by mortal limitations, able to mend broken bones, but powerless to address the deeper wounds that war and loss inflicted on the human spirit. Now, transformed and bonded with a being whose nature complemented her own in perfect harmony, she felt complete for the first time in her existence. A shadow hound lunged at her throat, its fangs seeking the vulnerable arteries that would have meant death to a mortal woman. But Elsbeth moved with inhuman grace, her own fangs extending as she met the creature's attack with predatory instincts she had never known she possessed. The hound's venom had no effect on her transformed physiology, and her counterattack sent it tumbling away with wounds that leaked supernatural essence like black blood. "You fight well for a newly turned vampire," Lucian called out, his voice carrying grudging respect even as he pressed his assault against Darian's defenses. "But you lack the killer instinct that centuries of existence teaches. You still think like a healer, trying to preserve life rather than taking it efficiently." "Perhaps," Elsbeth replied, her voice carrying new harmonics that spoke of power beyond mortal understanding. "But I understand something you never learned in your centuries of dominion, that true strength comes not from taking life, but from protecting it." As if to prove her point, the first of the Guardian families reached the cottage, their arrival marked by a coordinated assault that struck Lucian's forces from behind. Mrs. Henley's staff blazed with protective light that formed barriers around wounded defenders, while Willem's moonlight blade carved through shadow creatures like they were made of morning mist. Old Henrik's impossible bow sent arrows of pure energy into the hearts of enemies that had seemed invulnerable moments before. But even with reinforcements arriving, the battle remained desperately close. For every creature the defenders destroyed, two more seemed to emerge from the forest. Lucian himself, appeared unstoppable, the Alpha's crown amplifying his power until he moved like a force of nature rather than a single combatant. It was then that Elsbeth noticed something. The silver-haired vampire had not a flaw in the crown's construction that her newly awakened senses could perceive clearly. The artifact drew its power from the life force of its wearer, but it also created a feedback loop that could be exploited by someone who understood the principles involved. "Darian," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos of battle. "The crown, I can see how to turn it against him, but I'll need you to trust me completely and follow my lead, even if what I do seems to contradict everything your experience tells you." He met her eyes across the battlefield, and in that moment, their bond deepened beyond anything the claiming ritual had created. This was trust born not of supernatural connection, but of love freely given, the choice to believe in each other, even when logic suggested doubt. "Always," he said simply, and prepared to follow wherever her transformed intuition might lead them. The final phase of the battle for Thornwick was about to begin, and everything, their love, their lives, the safety of the village, and the future balance between supernatural and mortal worlds, hung in the balance of the next few moments. The moment Elsbeth spoke her plan, the very air around the cottage seemed to hold its breath. Her strategy was audacious beyond measure. Instead of fighting against the Alpha's crown's power, she intended to use her transformed nature to redirect that energy back upon itself, turning Lucian's greatest weapon into the instrument of his own destruction. But executing such a plan would require perfect synchronization between herself and Darian, a level of trust and coordination that even their supernatural bond had not yet fully tested. "The crown draws power from its wearer," she explained rapidly, her enhanced senses tracking the ebb and flow of supernatural energy that pulsed around Lucian's transformed form. "But it also creates vulnerability, a moment when all that accumulated force must cycle through his consciousness. If we can strike at precisely the right instant, we can overload the feedback loop and destroy both crown and wearer." Darian finished, his centuries of tactical experience immediately grasping the elegant brutality of her proposal. "But the timing will have to be perfect. One moment too early or too late, and we'll only succeed in making him stronger." Around them, the battle raged with supernatural fury that threatened to tear the cottage apart. Father Marcus maintained his protective chants, while the guardian families fought desperately to hold back the endless waves of shadow creatures pouring from the forest. Missus, Henley's crystal staff, blazed like a star as she created barriers of light around wounded defenders, while Willem's moonblade carved through enemies with strokes that left trails of silver fire in the air. But Lucian himself remained the greatest threat, the Alpha's crown transforming him into something that barely retained human form. His pale skin had taken on a metallic sheen, his eyes burned like red coals, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that made the ground beneath their feet tremble with sympathetic vibrations. "You cannot hide behind mortal guardians forever," he snarled, the hunter's blade weaving patterns of death as he advanced on Darian with implacable purpose. "I am the heir of the first vampire lords, blessed with authority that transcends your petty rebellion. Submit to the Covenant's will, and your death will be swift." In response, Elsbeth stepped forward and produced something that made every supernatural being in the vicinity freeze with shock, a chalice that seemed to be carved from crystallized moonlight, its surface covered with symbols that hurt to look upon directly. The binding chalice, she realized, with knowledge that came from her awakened bloodline, an artifact that had been hidden in her family's keeping for 20 generations, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. "This ends now," she declared, her voice carrying new authority that made even Lucian pause in his assault, not with submission, but with a choice freely made. The chalice began to glow in her hands, and suddenly the cottage filled with presences that had nothing to do with the battle raging around them. They were the spirits of all the vampire lords and ladies who had chosen love over dominion, beings who had died defending the principle that supernatural power should serve life rather than rule it. Their voices spoke in harmony, creating a counterpoint to the crown's malevolent energy. "The blood calls to blood," they chanted, just as Elsbeth's ancestors had done during her transformation. "The shadow seeks its sister. The choice is made, the path is set, the binding begins." Darian understood immediately what she intended. The binding chalice was not a weapon, but a tool of union, designed to permanently link two supernatural beings in a bond that would make them stronger than either could be alone. But using it in the midst of battle, surrounded by enemies who would stop at nothing to prevent its completion, required a level of courage that took his breath away. "If we do this," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the chaos of supernatural combat, "there will be no separation, ever. We will share not just power but consciousness itself, becoming something new that has never existed before." "I know," Elsbeth replied, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was proposing, "but some things are worth any risk." The moment she raised the chalice to her lips, Lucian roared with fury and, abandoning all pretense of tactical caution, hurled himself forward with the speed of lightning made flesh. The Alpha's crown blazed with power that turned the night itself red, and the hunter's blade extended to impossible length as supernatural energies transformed it into something more like a spear of crystallized malevolence than a mere dagger. But Elsbeth and Darian moved as one being, their supernatural bond, allowing them to anticipate each other's actions with perfect precision. As she drank from the binding chalice, he intercepted Lucian's charge with a counterattack that redirected the silver-haired vampire's momentum into the cottage's stone walls. The impact sent shockwaves through the building's foundations, but instead of weakening their position, it activated protective wards that had been carved into the very stones centuries ago. Power flowed between the bonded pair like lightning seeking ground, but this time it was controlled, directed, transformed into something that could challenge even the amplified might of the Alpha's crown. Elsbeth felt her consciousness expand to encompass not just her own thoughts, but Darian's as well, their combined awareness, creating a tactical intelligence that could perceive every enemy movement and counter them before they were fully formed. The final confrontation had begun in earnest, and the fate of everyone in Thornwick, mortal and supernatural alike, would be decided in the next few moments of transcendent violence. The moment Elsbeth completed the binding ritual, reality itself seemed to bend around the cottage. The eternal flame candle materialized in the center of the room, its supernatural fire burning with colors that had no names in mortal language. The candle's appearance marked the point of no return. The bond between Elsbeth and Darian was now permanent, unbreakable by death or time, and their combined power had transcended anything either could have achieved alone. Lucian struck the cottage wall with force that should have reduced the ancient stones to rubble, but the protective wards activated by their impact blazed with light that turned his supernatural strength against him. The Alpha's crown shrieked with metallic fury as competing energies tore at its structure, and for the first time since donning the artifact, the silver-haired vampire showed signs of strain. "Impossible," he gasped, his red eyes wide with disbelief as he stared at the unified form Elsbeth and Darian had become. They stood as two separate beings, but their movements were perfectly synchronized, their consciousness shared to a degree that made them functionally a single entity, with twice the power either had possessed individually. Through their expanded awareness, they could perceive every detail of the battlefield with crystalline clarity. The Guardian families were being overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Shadow creatures poured endlessly from the forest, while mist beings flowed through gaps in their defenses, like water finding cracks in stone. Willem bled from a dozen wounds as his moonblade grew dim with exhaustion, and Mrs. Henley's crystal staff flickered as Her strength waned under the constant assault. But the bonded pair could also see something Lucian could not, the precise moment when the Alpha's crown would cycle its accumulated power through his consciousness, creating the vulnerability Elsbeth had detected. In 17 seconds, the artifact would draw upon his life force to refresh its supernatural energies, and for a single heartbeat, all that power would flow directly through his mind. "Now," Elsbeth whispered, though the word emerged from both their lips in perfect unison. They moved with inhuman grace, Darian engaging Lucian in direct combat, while Elsbeth wove patterns of light that began to resonate with the crown's energy frequencies. The silver-haired vampire fought with desperate fury, the hunter's blade leaving trails of darkness as he sought to land the killing blow before whatever they planned could reach completion. But their coordination was flawless. Every attack Lucian launched met a perfect counter. Every desperate gambit was anticipated and neutralized. Through their shared consciousness, they fought not as two individuals but as aspects of a single strategic intelligence that could outthink and outmaneuver even centuries of vampiric experience. 15 seconds. The crown's energy began building toward its cyclic peak, and Lucian's form grew even more terrible as power flooded through him. His pale skin cracked like porcelain, revealing veins of molten gold beneath, and his voice took on harmonics that made the surviving windows shatter throughout the village. 10 seconds. Father Marcus completed a protective ritual that shielded the guardian families from the worst of the crown's emanations, but the effort left him drained and vulnerable. The endless waves of shadow creatures sensed his weakness and began converging on his position. 5 seconds. Elsbeth felt the resonance building to critical levels, her light weaving creating harmonic frequencies that would either amplify the crown's power beyond all control or collapse it entirely upon itself. There was no middle ground. Success meant Lucian's destruction, while failure would grant him power that could shatter the barriers between supernatural and mortal worlds. 3 seconds. Darian feinted left, drawing Lucian's attention and the hunter's blade away from Elsbeth as she prepared to release the accumulated energy at precisely the moment of the crown's vulnerability. 1 second. The Alpha's crown blazed with power that turned the night into artificial day, its energies cycling through Lucian's consciousness, just as Elsbeth released her harmonic resonance directly into the feedback loop. The result was catastrophic beyond imagination. The crown's structure couldn't contain the competing energies, and it shattered with an explosion of light and sound that struck every supernatural being within miles like a physical blow. Lucian screamed as his amplified power turned against him. The very forces he had, used to terrorize others, now consuming him from within. But instead of simply destroying him, the crown's destruction had an unexpected effect. The accumulated power of 5 centuries didn't dissipate, it transferred to the strongest supernatural presence in the immediate area. As the light faded, Elsbeth and Darian found themselves inheriting not just Lucian's personal power, but the authority the Alpha's crown had represented. The shadow creatures froze as their binding to Lucian's will snapped, then began dissolving back into the forest as their supernatural cohesion failed. The mist beings fled like smoke before wind, and the surviving members of the Crimson Covenant forces retreated in disarray, their leadership destroyed and their purpose shattered. In the sudden silence that followed, Father Marcus approached the bonded pair with something approaching awe. "You have become what the old chronicles called the sovereignty," he said, his voice filled with reverent wonder. "Vampire lords with the authority to command the supernatural realm, but bound by love rather than dominion." Through their shared consciousness, Elsbeth and Darian felt the weight of that responsibility settling upon them. They had saved Thornwick and defeated their enemies, but in doing so, they had become something unprecedented, rulers of a supernatural realm they had never sought to control. The eternal flame candle continued to burn, its light promising that their bond would endure through whatever challenges the future might bring. 3 months had passed since the night that changed everything, and autumn had given way to winter's first gentle snowfall. The cottage at the edge of Thornwick Forest looked much the same from the outside, the same stone walls, the same weathered shutters, the same herb garden now dormant beneath a blanket of white. But those who looked closely might notice that the shadows around the dwelling fell differently now, and that the very air seemed to shimmer with possibilities that had not existed before. Elsbeth stood at her kitchen window, watching the sunset paint the snow-covered forest in shades of rose and gold. Her reflection in the glass was subtly different from what it had been in her mortal days. Her skin held a luminous quality that spoke of supernatural transformation, and her eyes carried depths that suggested she had seen far more of the world than her 58 years might indicate. But when she smiled, as she did now while watching a family of deer venture close to the cottage without fear, the expression held all the warmth and compassion that had defined her throughout her mortal life. On her finger, alongside Thomas's simple gold wedding band, gleamed a new ring that had appeared the night of the binding ritual, the covenant ring. Wrought from metals that seemed to capture starlight itself, it marked her transformation and eternal bond with Darian. The ring was beautiful in ways that defied description, but more importantly, it served as a tangible reminder of the choice she had made to embrace love over safety, transformation over stagnation. Darian emerged from the spare room that had become his study, carrying an armload of correspondence that arrived daily from supernatural communities across Europe and beyond. Word of their victory over the Crimson Covenant had spread through the hidden world with remarkable speed, and it seemed every vampire clan, werewolf pack, and magical society had opinions about the unprecedented sovereignty they now represented. The Council of Prague wishes to formally recognize our authority over the Northern Territories, he said, settling the letters on the kitchen table with a smile that held both amusement and mild exasperation. The Vienna Compact requests our mediation in a dispute between two vampire houses that has raged for 60 years, and the London Brotherhood wants to know if we're accepting apprentices in the art of supernatural diplomacy. Elsbeth laughed, a sound that carried new harmonics since her transformation, but retained all its original warmth. A month ago, my greatest concern was whether my chamomile would survive the frost. Now they want me to mediate centuries-old feuds between creatures I'd never heard of. You could refuse, Darian said gently, though they both knew she would not. The power they had inherited from the Alpha's crown came with responsibilities neither of them took lightly. Supernatural communities that had lived in fear of the Crimson Covenant's brutal dominion now looked to them for protection and guidance, and Elsbeth's healer's instincts made turning away from such need impossible. Through the window, she could see lights beginning to appear in the village as families gathered for their evening meals. The people of Thornwick had adapted to the knowledge of the supernatural world with remarkable resilience, perhaps because so many of them had been guardian families all along. Mrs. Henley now tended a garden of protective herbs alongside her vegetables, while Willem had taken up the formal study of weapons blessed with supernatural properties. Even old Henrik had found new purpose, his abandoned beehives now home to creatures that were definitely not ordinary bees, but served similar functions in maintaining the natural balance. Father Marcus visited weekly, bringing news from other guardian communities and helping to establish the protocols that would govern interaction between mortal and supernatural worlds in their territory. The priest had aged visibly since the battle, but his eyes held a satisfaction that spoke of duties faithfully discharged and ancient compacts finally brought into the light. "Do you ever regret it?" Darian asked quietly, moving to stand beside her at the window. "The choice you made, the life you left behind?" Elsbeth considered the question seriously, as she always did when he posed it during their quiet moments together. The transformation had cost her much, the possibility of natural death, any chance of reunion with Thomas in whatever paradise awaited faithful souls, the simple humanity that had defined her for nearly 6 decades. But when she looked at Darian, when she felt the constant presence of his consciousness intertwined with hers, when she considered the good they were able to accomplish together, the answer came easily. "I regret nothing," she said, taking his cold hand in hers and feeling their bond pulse with shared warmth. "Thomas would have wanted me to live, to love, to find purpose in whatever years were granted me. That those years now stretch into eternity only means more opportunities to heal, to protect, to make the world a better place for both mortal and supernatural beings." As if to emphasize her words, a figure emerged from the forest, a young vampire, barely past the fledgling stage, stumbling through the snow with wounds that spoke of recent violence. Without hesitation, Elsbeth moved toward the door, her healer's instincts activated by the sight of suffering. "Another refugee from the Covenant's remaining cells," Darian observed, following her. "They've been trickling in for weeks, seeking sanctuary and guidance." Together, they helped the wounded vampire into their cottage, and Elsbeth began the work of tending injuries, while Darian gathered information about which supernatural threat the young being had escaped. It was work they had fallen into naturally, she providing healing and comfort, while he handled the more practical aspects of protection and justice. As she worked by lamplight, cleaning wounds and offering gentle words of reassurance, Elsbeth reflected on how perfectly her new existence integrated the life she had known with possibilities she could never have imagined. She was still a healer, still driven by compassion to ease suffering wherever she found it. But now she could offer sanctuary not just to wounded soldiers, but to supernatural beings fleeing persecution, could provide protection not just through herbs and bandages, but through power that commanded respect throughout the hidden world. The cottage had become a beacon for those seeking refuge from the supernatural conflicts that raged in the shadows of the mortal world. Under the protection of the sovereignty she and Darian represented, creatures who had lived in fear could find safety and guidance. It was work that gave meaning to immortality, purpose to power, and depth to love. Outside, snow continued to fall on the forest where they had first met, covering the world in pristine white that promised new beginnings. Inside the cottage, warmed by firelight and the glow of supernatural bonds, Elsbeth had found her true calling at last. She was no longer just a healer or just a vampire, but something new, a bridge between worlds, a guardian of the innocent, a woman who had chosen love over fear and found that the choice led not to an ending but to the most meaningful beginning of all.